thank you. Thanks all so much to everyone for coming. What a great subject. I can think of few other foods that most of us consume every day that are the subject of such huge oppositions and controversies as milk. Milk is the sweet taste of happy childhood memories, so much so that the Momofuku restaurants in New York sell an incredibly popular dessert called cereal milk, which is designed to taste like the dregs of sweet milk left behind in the bowl after your happy childhood bowl of cereal. And it really does. Milk is white and wholesome and innocent. It is the comfort of milk and cookies. It's rice pudding. It's a mug of warm milk at bedtime. It's calcium. Yet it's also lactose intolerance and unhappy cows pumped full of hormones and farmers going out of business because they can't get a fair price for their milk. And it's also everywhere in the food supply. I sometimes wonder what would happen to the industry of coffee chains if there was no milk, not to mention the breakfast cereal industry. So many other foods depend on milk. And this dairy crisis we're in is just the latest in the series of dramas in the history of cow's milk. In a book I wrote a few years ago called Swindled, I wrote about something called the swill milk scandal in New York City in the 1850s, when thousands of children died every year because they were fed milk that was produced by cows who were kept attached to distilleries, and they were fed on this horrible leftover alcoholic mash after whiskey was produced, and the alcohol got into the milk and then went to babies whose mothers had bought this milk because it was advertised as sort of the purest Orange County wholesome milk. They dyed it with special yellow food colouring to make it look like something far more wholesome than what it actually was. And I think this disparity between the wholesome image of milk and the sense that there's something darker going on hasn't gone away. Another scandal would have been the melamine scandal in China, when, again, babies died because of adulterated formula milk. And there are also the great debates about pasteurisation versus raw milk, which have now raged for more than a century, on which I hope we're going to get to in a minute. So, lots to discuss. And I'd like to start, we've got a fantastic panel here of milk experts who come at the subject from various different angles. And I'd like to start by asking each of them to say a bit about what their interest in milk is and who they are. So I'd like to start with Steve Hook of Hook & Son.
Hello, good evening. Oh, I forgot to turn it on. Hello? No? Hello, that's better. I'm Stephen Hook from Hook & Son. Good evening. I farmed with my father, very simply in 2006 as tenant dairy farmers. We were both sitting at the kitchen table with their heads in our hands wondering what we were going to do. We decided to sell unpasteurised milk from our 75 cows. Today, we're the leading brand for raw milk. We sell 45% of the raw milk market in the UK, and our business has grown. We employ 24 people, and my 75 cows have a fantastic time on a very extensive organic farm.
Can I now ask Dill Peeling of Compassion World Farming?
Are we on? Thanks, Bea. Yes, good afternoon. My name is Dill Peeling. I'm the Campaigns Director from Compassion in World Farming. Compassion is a campaigning, lobbying organisation. We campaign against factory farming globally. What do I mean by factory farming? Back of an envelope definition, if you like, is that it's about the intense confinement of animals and the grain feeding of animals. We confine them and we feed them grain. We don't like the intense confinement of factory farming because it's cruel. We don't like the grain feeding of these animals in the industrial agriculture because we've got better things to do with grain. Most of the crops that we grow in Europe, we do not give to people. We give to animals, mainly in industrial systems. And while the good and the great are scratching their heads trying to think how we're going to feed a growing world population of perhaps 3 billion more people over the next 35 years, by coincidence, we're giving enough human edible grain to feed 3.5 billion people to animals largely in industrial systems. And we think that's an outrage. What's this got to do with dairy? Well, I would estimate that now in the UK, 20% of our dairy cows, when they are lactating, never see the light of day. They are confined indoors all the time in factory farms for cows. And cows, as you know, famously eat grass. Why on earth we would want to bring them in and feed them grain, I can never understand. We believe that cows belong in fields. Thank you.
So the next person on the panel is Rennie, who is the self-styled Dairy Maid, and she's a cheese teacher and also a former Heidi who kept her own goat herd.
Yeah, that's true. So a little bit about me. I run a dairy consultancy called the Dairy Maid. I've been teaching cheese making for the last 4 years. And in that time, I also had my own herd of dairy goats, which I crossbred, so they were for meat and milk. There is a use for males out of the dairy industry. And I was making my own cheese, ice cream, yoghurt, butter. I am also a cheese and a dairy judge, so by dairy products, that's liquid milk, creams, butters, things like that. I class myself as a professional cheese eater. I hone that skill daily. It requires a lot of training. I'm an avid trainer. And I suppose I favour pasture-fed, both in meat and milk, and I'm certainly in favour of raw milk. I'll lay that down right now.
Great, thank you. And our final panellist is Charlie Taverner, who is a writer for the Farmers Weekly. He's been covering the dairy crisis on an almost daily basis, and he's also the son of a dairy farmer.
Hello, I'm Charlie Taverner, reporter at Farmers Weekly, and dairy farmer son from Devon, so I've been in dairy all my life, it feels like. My first my biggest memory with dairy and with milk is probably a lot of mornings before school, coming down, opening the fridge, finding, crap, we've got no milk. So putting on my boots very quickly while in my school uniform, running out to the parlour, climbing on top of the bulk tank, these kind of big silver tanks, opening the lid, leaning in, and I'm like 7, 8 at this point, and not being able to reach the milk at the bottom. So we're at home we're milking about 320 cows a milk at the moment. Jersey, Friesian crosses, quite an extensive system, and we calve in the autumn. And we've always done a little bit because right across the sector, in that we used to be organic, we're not anymore. And we make a lot of our milk into ice cream as well that we sell.
Great, thank you. I wanted to kind of begin the general discussion with a question about flavour. Dan Barber, in a recent book called The Third Plate, talks about how we've lost the taste of wheat because it's a staple food that's so ubiquitous we've forgotten that it even has a flavour. And I'm wondering if the same might be true of milk. Is it a substance that's just so ever-present in our lives we just forget what it's meant to taste like? And I wanted to ask Leanna to start this off.
Well, actually, very similar to you, I grew up next door to a dairy farm, and it's very strange, I had exactly the same childhood memory that I too used to dangle over the bulk tank with a Tupperware plastic jug. Tupperware, oh yes. And alarmingly, my mother still has that jug, but I'm quite chuffed that she does, to get the milk in the morning. And it has, that straight out of the cow. It was still warm, it hadn't even chilled down. And fresh milk, for me, should be raw milk. It doesn't need to go through all these processes. But it tastes sweet. It tastes nothing like the stuff that we get out of plastic bottles with different coloured lids.
How does it taste different?
How does it taste? Whenever I teach cheese making, I always do a milk tasting as well. I don't care if people say, oh, I don't really drink milk. I'm not doing it for you to like the flavour. I'm doing it to illustrate the difference in mouthfeel and flavour and composition of the milk, because these processes that we put milk through do change it. So raw milk...
Some people really not like the flavour when they try it. Is it something quite aversive on the first sip?
I've never ever had anybody spit out the raw milk. I do it blind. I don't tell you what you're tasting. You just have to do it. Weirdly enough, the ones that people tend not to like are the Alpro. the milks that come from the nuts and things like that, probably because it takes them by surprise, because they're not expecting that. And also the goat's milk, when I make them taste the pasteurised goat's milk, because it almost has a salty mouthfeel to it. And also skimmed, pasteurised, homogenised milk. Not a lot going on there. Whereas raw milk has a real creamy feel in the mouth. It really coats your mouth, not in a claggy way, but in a very clean way. And all I can really tell you is it has got a sweetness to it, mainly because the raw milk in that tasting is so much fresher than anything that's come off the supermarket shelf by comparison, because we've got no idea. A bit like the Budweiser bottles, we've got no idea when that milk was born, when it was produced. We just know when it goes, in theory, out of date.
I wonder if Steve wants to chip in at this point. What does really great raw milk taste like?
White heaven in a glass. Raw milk, when we do samples at farmers market, we invite people to taste the milk. And it's interesting, the older generation will say, wow, I haven't tasted milk like this for years. And the younger generation will say, wow, I've never tasted milk like this. It's a new experience. The taste does change with raw milk. I would say the best tasting raw milk is grass-fed milk. I think that gives it a sweeter taste. But the taste will change. As a fresh milk, the lactose is very strong, so it will have a sweet taste. But because it's a live milk, the bacteria will eat the lactose. And after about a week, that conversion of lactose to lactic acid in raw milk will convert the taste to a sour taste. And I've got customers who want my milk because they want sour milk and they can't pasteurize sour milk. They can't sour pasteurized milk. So the taste will change with raw milk, there's no doubt about that. But one reaction that I always get from people who try the milk is it's milk. As though they're expecting something other than milk, but it is milk. But they're surprised at how natural and pure the experience of tasting raw milk feels. It doesn't leave a greasy, funny aftertaste or a gaggy aftertaste. And I have lots of customers who say that they can't drink milk in terms of necking a half pint, for example, but they find that they can easily drink raw milk. It's because it's all in its natural state and the body can digest it and use it.
Because my next question was going to be, maybe Charlie can answer, are you a raw milk fan as well?
Well, having been brought up on the stuff,
yes. So when you go from being habituated to the taste of raw milk back to supermarket milk, how does that taste?
Undeniably, if you taste the two next to each other, because of the way fat is skimmed off as well, supermarket milk it's thinner. I think that's maybe a way to describe it in the mouthfeel. And there is a richer and altogether more kind of rounded about raw milk. And also just full fat milk as well. That's the important bit as well. Go on.
Yeah, very simply, when milk goes to be processed in the pasteurising plant, in order to be classed or defined as whole milk, it has to be 3.5% butterfat or fat. Milk is usually on farm produced at 4%. So when the dairies get the milk, they can legally, if you like, skim off 0.5% of milk and still sell it as whole milk.
So whole milk isn't actually whole milk at all, necessarily.
It's not the same fat content that comes off from the cow in milk.
And when you taste, maybe you never do, when you taste supermarket milk, does it have bad flavours or is it the absence of flavour?
I remember as a boy staying with my granddad who lived in London, and it was the only time I ever had pasteurised milk. And I used to, I know that I'm a dairy farmer and I'm from the dairy industry, but to me that wasn't what milk should be, and I didn't like drinking, and I still don't like drinking or having pasteurised milk. And that was one of the reasons that we started to sell raw milk, because I believed in raw milk as a product and not in pasteurised milk as a product.
Yeah.
I actually, interestingly, I also didn't drink milk for many, many years, because the only thing that I had access to, I believed, this was before I found out, about Steve, the only thing I had access to was supermarket milk. So I only got back into drinking raw milk, and in fact milk, when I had my own goats. And I actually had milked them one day and was looking at these bottles of milk thinking, oh, well, I think I'm going to try that. It was the best thing I've ever tasted. The best.
I just want to talk in defence of supermarket milk for a moment, because it's there and it's out there, and it's it's the vast majority of milk we consume. And was it yesterday? It was maybe Monday or Tuesday. Anyway, needed a quick snack in the afternoon, and I went to the supermarket and got one of the small. What would it be? It's a pinter, exactly, and just drank that as a snack and a drink. And it's still really good. I really enjoyed it. It's delicious. And there's great value in that product as well. It's still really good. It may not be the real heritage, the real rich quality we're talking about, but it's still fantastic.
It's still probably one of the healthier things you can buy in a supermarket, isn't it? That's good to go.
Absolutely. And we'll
and also, the thing I noticed, and I'm sure everyone else in this room, is the difference in flavour profile between sort of fresh supermarket milk. I know it's not fresh in your terms or your terms, it's all denatured and dead, but it's still, when you're drinking it well before it's used by date versus when it kind of gets that saltiness and kind of, when it's about to go off, there are differences, aren't there?
Yeah, and there are brands, I say brands, there are small farms who process their own milk and sell that very much as the best quality. The milk that goes through big processors does, by its very nature, take longer to get to the supermarket shelf than that very day being delivered straight out of the cow. So lots of people do market on that.
I think we're going to get back to the whole raw versus pasteurised question, but first I wanted to ask Dill first this question. We're in the middle of this terrible crisis for dairy. How do we get out of the crisis, and what is the nature of the crisis in your opinion?
I certainly believe that dairy farming has been sold a mirage over the recent years. I think there is a broad belief that modernity means intensification, and intensification is the only way forward. I think a lot of people have discovered to their cost that isn't the truth. I've very much seen, I've been working in the dairy sector for 30 years, and I've seen over that period people who get sucked into the treadmill of intensification. But once you start having a cow producing perhaps eight depends on the quality of the grazing, but 9,000 litres, it becomes harder and harder to produce that amount of milk on grass. So you have to start supplementing. Once you start getting to high levels of yielding, high levels of supplementing, you have to start bringing those cows in. And once you start bringing them in, you're talking about high veterinary inputs, you're talking about cows that don't last as long, maybe 2 or 3 lactations, you've got to cull them, you've got turnover prices, you've got investments in your buildings, and you're buying into a high production, low margin model. Typically, you would expect an extensive dairy farmer on grass to be making about twice as much margin per litre of milk than somebody in these intensive systems. But as the pressure increases, they forever have to push that higher production. The cows pay the cost. They get mastitis, they get lameness, they get culled earlier, they die earlier, they're restricted in these systems. But the farmers pay the cost, that they get chewed over and spat out at the end of that system. And we're seeing about 1,000 dairy farmers a year leave that system. It's certainly not the dairy farmers' fault that they're buying into the advice given to them by their vets, by their productionists, by the feed companies. They're responding partly to the incentives we put in place through our government policies and our corporate policies. So I think it lies in all those areas.
So in your terms, does this mean that the only sustainable milk currently sold is organic, because that's the only milk that legally has to be pasture-fed?
I buy organic milk when I do. Actually, I was also raised next to a dairy farm, so that makes all 4 of us. And you've reminded me of the green top milk that I used to get, and I haven't tasted it for ages, and I am going to go out and get some more. Yeah, brilliant, I will. I do buy organic. That's because, it's about labelling, it's about information. I know that if I buy organic, then I'm getting pasture-fed milk. And that's what I want for reasons of sustainability, for reasons of animal welfare. I'm not a purist about it. If we had a label in there for pasture-fed, yes, absolutely.
Organic,
I'm not not a purist about it at all. I mean, the issue is that providing good welfare for those animals? Is it one that's absorbing precious grain stocks?
Charlie, as someone who's followed the crisis very closely, do you share Dill's analysis?
No, I think I'm sorry, but it's far too much of a simplification to say that is the one direction that the industry is going in. It's probably going to split in two ways. I'd say that you might go down there are different types of systems for producing milk. You have extensive grazing systems or you have high input house systems, and one is not necessarily better than the other. Welfare on one is not necessarily better than the other. Health is not better on one than the other. In September last year, I was in China and I was walking around a dairy farm, and they're known for having big industrial agriculture. It was a big part of Farmageddon. It was talking about the scale of these units, and it was one of the best dairy units I've ever seen. It was 1,000 Holstein heifers, and they were being housed all year round, and they were in immaculate condition. Health was fantastic, and the farm was just kind of crazy about biosecurity, about health, and about fertility. That was their focus all the way. And I've been around so many dairy farms in this country running all different kinds of systems. In fact, I was speaking to a farmer last week who runs 1,500 cows, which you think, well, mega dairy. They're out pretty much all year round. They're in outdoor cubicles. So there's not one size fits all, and there's not one direction that the industry is going. And just saying that one system is bad and that's the way everything is heading is a bit of an unfair characterisation. I mean, there's a wider thing about the dairy crisis and what's causing that as well. That is sadly a very simple situation at the moment of supply and demand, in which there's been a huge amount of milk in the world. European production last year was 4.5% higher. Demand didn't even scrape anywhere near that in terms of growth. And by that nature, prices come down heavily because there's less demand, less people want to buy the stuff. There's also a factor in this country is that we've had heavy discounting of milk in supermarkets. In fact, all food products have suffered really heavily, so our buffer from world markets and world trade has been pulled away.
Is there anything that can be done about that to make the buffer better for farmers?
Definitely. There's been a lot in the press and a lot of time and money spent by supermarkets talking about, we do this great work for our farmers right across the board. And some do. About between 10 and 20% of milk in the country is on directly aligned contracts going straight to a supermarket. And that means, in most of those cases, that those farmers will have an average cost of production of more than 30p a litre covered, plus a little bit more for reinvestment. The problem is that's not all the milk in the country. If that's 20%, that's not a huge amount, especially when only half of milk in the UK goes into what we call the liquid market, so that ends up on the shelf.
So we demonise the supermarkets for giving the worst prices, but you're saying that some people are actually giving farmers even worse prices per litre?
Yes, because the rest of that milk that isn't going into supermarkets and not getting one of those cost of production covering prices is exposed to world commodity markets, largely.
And what's the solution to that?
I hope that there's a drought in New Zealand and they can't produce as much milk at the moment.
So it's a hope and a pray. You haven't got a political solution. Leanna, how do you how do you read the dairy crisis? What do you see as being the situation and possible way out?
I guess I'm a bit simple with it, and you were saying the fact that demand hasn't increased. Well, given what I've tasted from some of the milk that's on the shelves, I'm not surprised. I strongly believe that we all have a responsibility to, certainly with other products, we've said that we want to know where it comes from, we want to know who produces it, we want more provenance and we want more traceability. A lot of the milk that we buy is multiple farms, it's pooled milk, it's been standardised, it's been homogenised. It loses all of its identity of whoever produced that milk. All we really know is whether it was organic, whether or not it's British. We have no label for pasture-fed as such. I know many farmers who farm to organic principles but who are not certified because of the fees and because that sometimes they need to go off that track. Sometimes they need to supplement the feed with something that's non-organic. They can get fined for that. They can get penalised. And given how precarious dairy farming is, that can make or break a farm. I don't have a solution to it. My note that I wrote was, it's true. It's such
So your
so
position is
huge.
what you want consumers to be prepared to pay higher prices.
I don't really see why we think we're entitled to cheap food. I know I mentioned this to you at the beginning, but where I used to teach, or where I still teach up in Nottinghamshire at the School of Artisan Food, we're really lucky. We've got a raw milk producer 2 miles down the road, and whenever I teach, we go there. And it always astounds people when they're in the milking parlour, and it's not just milk that's coming your way when you're down there. And it's a hard job. It's a really hard job, and I know because I've had my own livestock, and where there's livestock, there's dead stock, and it's emotionally and physically hard work. And I think if we could get all children, and it'd be good if we had one of their parents, because they probably pay the supermarket bill or the weekly shopping bill, to spend one morning in a milking parlour, people would have a very different view on what is a true and fair price to pay for our milk.
Steve, I'd love to have your input here as someone who's inside the industry. Presumably, you get paid a lot more for your milk now that you've switched to a raw milk system.
Yeah, we do. Raw milk is about 8 to 10 times the price of shop milk.
8 to 10 times.
8 to 10 times the price. And either it's 8 to 10 times better, or farmers are being badly shortchanged. I'd love Dairy UK to answer that question, which is the Association of the Pasteurising Industry. Coming back to supermarkets and so on, it's not 50% of the market is a local liquid market for the UK, so that 50% of the milk that we produce is liquid for the UK isn't a global market, it's our own domestic market. So the global issues don't fully hold against us because 50% of the milk is at home. The industry it's not just the dairy farming industry, the whole dairy industry's got an issue because it's getting more global. It's not just fresh milk that's available, you've got UHT and filtered milks which last for months and months, which means that milk can be transported more easily and it's commoditised more and more.
You're saying that affects the overall price of milk?
It does, and it also affects the image of milk, and milk as a food has lost its way. People don't respect milk as much as they did 30 years ago as part of their diet.
This first question about whether we're taking it for granted and we've forgotten that it...
We have, and people don't worry, they don't value it as part of their diet, they don't buy as much milk as they used to as part of their diet. So we've got to come back and back to where we should be. The supermarkets, I know that it's the consumer that's got the penny in their pocket and they're the ones that ultimately control things, but the consumer's got very little choice at the moment. It's well over 50% of the milk is sold in the supermarket now and not on the doorstep. So the supermarket has got a lot to play in this, and the problem that we've got is that the supermarket worries about two things. They worry about the dividend they pay to their shareholders, and Tesco's and so on are in big strife at the moment because they need to return a profit of 6 or 7% to their shareholders, whereas Aldi and Lidl can do it at 2% because they're family owned. And that's one thing. But the other thing is that the supermarket worries about a thing that I call the basket factor, which means when you do your weekly shop, you go around the store with a list of products you're going to buy and you buy spontaneously as you go around. Suddenly when you get to the till, it's 20 quid more than normal and you think, crikey, it's gone up in here, I'm going to shop elsewhere. And that worries the supermarket, and the only control that they've got over that is to make sure the products that you buy week in, week out are as cheap as possible, and milk is number one. Now how we overcome that as an industry, I'm not sure.
I just want to come back, something you just said really struck me, and I'll ask Dill this first because it leads on to one of my next questions, which is, you just said milk plays a smaller role in our diet, we don't drink as much milk as we used to. Now my impression anecdotally, like if I look around places, all these coffee chains which didn't used to exist in our lives until quite recently, Starbucks, what people are mostly consuming there is not coffee but milk. People seem to be drinking buckets of milk. Do any of you, well first of all I'd be interested if any of you actually have statistics on milk in our diets. Has it actually gone down rather than up? And what is the role of milk in our diets in general? Should we be drinking more or less, given that most of the milk produced is produced in these ways which are less than perfect? Dill?
In terms of statistics, and again, you may have them, but my sense is that...
Yeah.
Sure.
Quickly then. It's not the most up to date in the world, but actually we can extrapolate it in the last year. So between 2002 and 2013, we drink 8% less milk, but at the same time we eat slightly more cheese and about 19.2% more yoghurt. So there's the background. There we are. Yeah.
So overall, we may be consuming roughly the same amount of dairy, but in slightly different forms.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And I think that's borne out by the production figures as well, which although the structure has changed, the actual overall production figures have stayed pretty well the same for a long period of time.
So Dylan, on the question of milk in our diets, and should we be drinking more or less?
I think everybody accepts there's a good argument for moderation in all things, and an excessive diet of anything isn't good for us. But I think milk is a very important part of our diet. It's a culturally important part of our diet as well. In terms of consuming animal products, we're certainly not a vegetarian organisation, and I'm certainly not a vegetarian either. But there is the case for making sure that we're moderate in it, in terms of the pressure we put on the environment, and in terms of the pressure we put on our own systems. But that's very different to saying that we need to curb at any dramatic amount the amount of milk that we eat in Britain.
Leanna, what's your take on this?
Well, I'd be interested to know out of some of these figures, certainly that how much, we're talking about liquid milk used for drinking or used for cooking. We also love a fad, we love a new theme to go on. So let's all get our protein shakes out. We know what we need in our diet, we just don't actually want a diet that provides it. We want it in a bottle or in a pill or something like that. And I know that an awful lot of milk and whey goes off to be processed into powdered whey, and that is actually really quite expensive. People are quite willing to pay for that, alarmingly. So I actually feel that maybe we don't need to drink more milk. And maybe we need to drink more or eat more yogurt and cheese and other dairy products. Certainly, a lot of my friends buy shed loads of milk every week. They don't consume any of it, but they ram it down their children's necks like there's no tomorrow. And I strongly believe that you need to be putting a little bit of everything. Sometimes I have a lot.
So actually, I've been researching the subject for my new book, which is about how we learn to eat, and I was talking to a leading obesity paediatrician who was saying there's this phenomenon, I hadn't come across it before, called continuous milk intake in the second year of life. So mums think, because we all know that milk is the one thing that's good for children, they're feeding them up to 1 litre of whole cow's milk a day, which leaves them too stuffed to eat other whole foods, so they don't try anything, so they get fussier and fussier, so all they want is milk, so they drink more milk, and they're seen at two ends of the spectrum. They may turn up in feeding disorder clinics as kids that won't eat anything, or else they turn up in the obesity clinics as kids who are overweight by the age of 3. And I just hadn't come, and I think it's kind of graphic illustration of how much we put our faith in milk, and sometimes that faith is misplaced. Charlie, do you have a take on milk in our diets? Maybe lactose intolerance is something we could also come to. I know Steve has views on this.
I think in developed countries we consume about 100 kilos of dairy products a year. And interestingly, in China, we talked about China, and I talked about growing global demand for dairy earlier. They're the big driver of that. And the big reason behind that is that there is state-sponsored encouragement for consuming more dairy products, particularly infant formula. That's part of the reason why we're in a bit of a crisis right now, in that China heavily stockpiled milk powder because of this. And there's not very much intelligence about how much China has got of anything, let alone economic growth. So it's very difficult to rely on that. So clearly in that country, they are seeing the health benefits, particularly for infants, of dairy products. And increasingly, because cheese consumption there is very low, for example, that's becoming an important part of their diets as well. And famously, the Chinese population is like 90% lactose intolerant. You hear very high figures, again, and that's interesting as well, that they're still thinking, despite that genetic reason why they've got limited ability to digest dairy, they still see it as very important.
Much as they're also moving to increase meat eating, and it's part of a sort of growing middle class, isn't it?
Absolutely, particularly those other value dairy products like infant formula. It's got limited lifespan in that you can only give it to children of a certain age. teenagers and adults aren't going to have so much fun swilling that. But things like cheese, yogurts, UHT milk, for example. There's a Welsh dairy farm called Treoni that are making UHT flavoured milks and shipping them from West Wales to China in big containers from a family farm. So there's lots of opportunities because people around the world clearly see dairy is important. Maybe have we reached peak dairy consumption in the UK? I'm not sure. No, definitely not with cheese.
I'm not finished by a long way. Steve, I know Steve has really interesting things to say about the nutritional qualities of milk, but also I think you have a take on this rising tide of lactose intolerance, and that there may be more to it than there seems.
Right, yeah. Very simply, coming back to the figures on liquid milk and the reason why we're drinking more processed stuff, eating more processed foods here in terms of yogurt and cheese and so on, and not so much liquid, that's to the detriment of our industry here, because the Dairy Crest and so on have relied heavily on the liquid market and haven't invested in added value foods like yogurt and cheddar cheese and so on, which means the added value dairy products are coming in from Europe and not really being produced at home, but they're starting to be produced here by some very niche, high quality producers. There's some fantastic cheese being produced in the UK at the moment by smaller firms and bigger firms. Milk as a drink, obviously I want to see more milk consumed. Milk is the growth food. There are only 2 foods that are designed as foods. All the other foods that we eat have got another purpose. Meat is muscle, eggs are fertility, salads are plants, but milk and honey are the only 2 foods that are designed as foods. And they are also the only 2 foods that in their natural state don't decay. All other foods decay. That's raw milk, not pasteurised milk. Pasteurised milk will break down. Now, I could go into that, but I'll give you another interesting thing about milk. A lady 2 years ago went on a raw milk fast. She's got children, she lives in London. For 28 days she had nothing but our milk, and she was cooking spaghetti bolognese for her children and so on. In that time, the only thing she needed was iron, because she got a bit anemic. There's not a lot of iron in milk, but that was it. She lost 4 pounds in weight, her skin improved, she never felt hungry. It is as near as you can get to the perfect food. I can't think what I was going to say.
I mean, so with lactose intolerance, is it not right that you have customers who believe they were lactose intolerant before, but they're able to tolerate?
I believe that 80% of lactose intolerant people can have raw dairy, they can't have pasteurised dairy.
So how do you come at this figure of 80%?
That's come from the Western A Price Foundation, who are advocates of traditional food. Essentially it works in 2 or 3 ways. One is that raw milk has got bacteria in it that break down sugars, lactose into 2 other sugars that are digestible by people. Although they can't digest lactose, they can digest the 2 sugars that lactose gets broken down into by bacteria in raw milk. Also, the school's out on whether lactase enzyme exists in raw milk. Lactase enzyme is the enzyme that you need to digest lactose. The human body often stops producing lactase itself, so that's why people become lactose intolerant. And the third way that people can overcome lactose intolerance is by letting raw milk sour. As I said earlier, the bacteria eat the lactose and convert it to lactic acid, and sour milk will have no lactose in it, so you can drink milk.
Before we open it up to audience questions, I just wanted to ask all of you one final question, which is, what is the future of milk? Do any of you have a vision of what your ideal future would be and what you think is actually going to happen? Dill?
The future world is going to be one which has to be low on carbon use, low on petroleum use. It's going to have to be one that feeds a lot more people. It's going to have to be an extensive model of production which allows us to do that. My concern is that it may go the other way, and it may end up providing milk for those that can afford it at the expense of food for those who can't. That's up to us as a global community how we handle it.
And for you, the key shift would be moving cows onto grassland away from grain feeding?
Yes, exactly. Extensively reared, pasture-fed milk. Yeah.
Leanna, what's your future of milk?
What I'd like when I close my eyes at night and have a lovely dream about dairy farms, is that we would see more people drinking raw milk, buying raw milk to make it into their own cheese and yogurt at home, that we'll be buying more locally, that we could bring back a few more local dairy farms, doorstep deliveries. I'd love to see that. We have a responsibility towards that. I think what's more likely is that we'll see more factory farming. The more we see of it, the less sensitive we are to it. We become desensitized to these things. Given how sterile some of our diets are, we'll probably end up just drinking UHT.
Charlie?
What I'd really like to see is a return to understanding the real value and the high quality of milk, and a greater appreciation of that. Because I think what we've got to fight across all food, and milk is right at the front line of this, is commoditisation. That's what's killing the dairy industry at the moment and leading to changes that are completely out of everyone's control, because it's this downward push all the time on price. And that value is the only thing, it's all about being as cheap as possible, when we should really be saying why this product is great and why it should be valued in this way. On the production side of things, I don't think we'll necessarily go down one kind of big scale route, because in this country we do have a variety of systems. We've got a very big variety of landscapes. We are not New Zealand, and we're not Ireland, and we're not Australia, and we don't have the ability to be fully extensive grazing for all the dairy units that we have across the country today. It just hasn't got the landscape for it, and the cows would not enjoy being outside in those conditions. I tell you, it would be really tough. So I think we will continue, hopefully, to have a good variety of systems being run with exceptionally high welfare and exceptionally high cow health, and we're producing really brilliant dairy products that consumers can value, because there is understanding on the price on the shelf that these products are really worth something and they're worth paying for.
So you really say we should be prouder of the milk that we do have now? We haven't yet gone down into your dystopia of everyone drinking UHT? Absolutely,
and I think what the UK can do really well on food is produce high quality, excellent stuff with great stories behind it. Like I said, because we're not like those countries like Ireland and New Zealand that can produce, because of their climate, huge amounts of grass, which means they can produce milk very, very cheaply. Those guys can engage in commodity markets very easily because they can ride out volatility with low costs of production. They can do that. UK, because of our landscape, the way the industry is structured, because of our big domestic market as well, that those other countries don't necessarily have. We've got to make the most of high quality, and it's the same for lamb, it's the same for beef, it's the same for all the real products that we make, that we can focus on producing high quality and leave hopefully some of the volatility and the challenges of being a commodity producer to other nations.
Great. And finally, Steve, what's your future of milk?
I think it's a bright one if you're in raw milk.
It sounds like a crisis 10 times.
Absolutely. But I think for the future of milk, I think it'd be fantastic if the government allowed vending machines to sell raw milk to be legal. The reason for that is farmers do a fantastic job producing milk. They're working hard to produce milk, and that's what they love doing, is producing milk. They're not good marketers of the milk that they produce. And it's the grass-fed farms on hills and so on who are having the toughest time, because they farm on beautiful landscapes, but those landscapes are generally the toughest. If that farmer could put his own vending machine in the village shop and sell raw milk at 8 to 10 times the price, that creates a new cash income stream for that farm, which could be the lifesaver for that farm. It's great for the village shop, it empowers the local community. That's what's happened in Italy. In Italy they had 300 vending machines 3 years ago. Today they have over 1,500, and it's empowered the small farmers, and people can buy high quality local raw milk if they want to. And the future has got to be choice for the consumer and information for the consumer. For a long time the consumer has been spoon-fed information about the dairy products from the big pasteurising industry, but there is a choice, and what should be funded is research into why raw milk is good for you. Nobody's going to fund that research because it's not in the pasteurising industry's interest, it's not in the pharmaceutical industry's interest, but the consumer, the public, need to know the truth about raw milk.
Thank you. On that note, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Yes, we have one over here.
Hi, I'm Chris from a charity called Sustain, coordinate the London Food Link. We're a food and farming charity. Something like 6 million glasses of milk are thrown away, wasted each day in the UK. It's part of the problem, the low prices that we're paying, and we just don't value it anymore. And would paying a higher price mean less food waste, as well as a fair price for farmers? And do you think there's a space for the equivalent of a fair trade milk in the UK?
Who should we put this to?
I'm happy, to go with it. I think you're absolutely right. When I went around the country with the Moo Man film, Lord Rooker at a screening in Ludlow said, this is lovely film about a lovely little farm, but that's not the way we're going to feed the population. But it is the way that we're going to feed the population, because extensive farms in tough places are the ones that are producing food off marginal land that big industry won't farm. If we sort out our waste problem, 30% of or 40% of food being wasted, if I gave a family 100 quid on Saturday and then went back to their house and took 40 quid off them and chucked it in the bin, they'd think I'm nuts, but that's what families are doing. Sort out our food waste to feed people, that's the first thing that should be done. And food is too cheap, people don't respect their food, and if they respected their food, they would be healthier and there'd be less food waste.
I'd be interested to know, out of all of that gets thrown away, how much of those people's decisions to chuck it down the plug hole is governed by, for risk of opening another debate, best before dates, and whether it's been on an offer in the supermarket and so people have bought it in order to get the cheaper offer and actually they don't need it.
Sorry, did you have something?
Yeah. You'd expect me just to say farmers need to be paid more, and I think the price on the shelf is a travesty, and it is a disgrace that milk that's such a high quality product is sold so cheaply. And the fact that one that gets me is, look, just next time you go in a big supermarket, look at the difference between 2 pints of milk and 4 pints of milk. There's not much in there. Go on.
You mentioned in your question about a fair trade price, or should there be a fair milk badge basically, or brand, which would really embarrass the supermarkets if that applied to our domestic farmers. What happened in the 1930s was, when the dairies were starting up, they started to literally abuse the farmers, because the farmers got to send his milk every day to clear the tank for the cows to put the next milking's milk into. It's got to be moved the whole time, it's a flow of milk. And the dairies know that, and they, in the 1930s, knowing the farmer got a perishable product, cut the price and the farmer had to take it. The farmer is a price taker. And in that situation, in the 1930s, the government set up the Milk Marketing Board to protect the dairy farmer, to put this shield over the dairy farmer. In 1991, the Milk Marketing Board, which is a statutory body as a price fixer between the farmer and the trade, was disbanded, and now the farmer is at the mercy of the free market with a perishable product and no selling strength.
John, did you have something to say?
It's always nice to have a little bit of disagreement on the panel. Yes, I think it's a very good point. Obviously, if we do have a higher price for our milk, then we would expect less of it to be thrown away. A higher price looks like a good idea. I've just got that one note of caution that when we look back on dairy prices and look back to the 90s when dairy prices were at an all-time high, from an animal welfare point of view, dairy farmers were still shipping live calves across the channel into Europe at the time. They were still increasing the yields coming off the cows and pushing them unsustainably. I would love to see a higher price paid to milk. I think we should bust a gut by every single mechanism we can, but I think what has to come from the farming side is to provide us with a truly sustainable and ethical product that is worth paying that extra premium for.
Sustainable for the farmers, if not for the animals.
Well, it depends. Certainly more economically sustainable for the farmers, but when we're talking about the milk, is that going to drive them to further intensification of the industry? If so, then we're funding farmers to produce a less sustainable and less ethical product. when we can use exactly the same mechanisms to get a broader, more valuable product to society as a whole. Charlie, I don't share your complacency that we're not on a slippery slope in terms of intensification. I know we're not New Zealand. We're probably closer to Denmark. We're at a similar latitude. We are amongst the highest producing, the highest yielding cows are found in Britain and in Denmark. We face very similar challenges. I would say about 20% of our cows are in zero grazing systems at the moment. That's where Denmark was in 2000. Now they're at 75%.
I don't know, where's the 20%, well, where does the 20% come from? Because it's our industry body, well, obviously they have a vested interest, and so we all do, but we'll put it lower than that anyway. And as I said, the systems debate, we could go on forever, and we'll go around in circles, because we'll talk about one is better than the other, and welfare potential, and one is higher or lower than the other. I understand that. When we're talking about value of the product, though, if there is more money in the chain, just a little bit more in terms of breathing space that farmers then can invest, because high welfare systems can cost more money. The care and the effort, as you said, if getting bigger is a race to the bottom, then what is staying the same size? It's not a race. We've got to have some value in there. The other important thing to forget, that not to forget in all this, is the consumer, the shopper. And falling food prices is a very good thing for the vast majority of people in this country in terms of how much cash they've got in their pocket. We cannot forget that. I think food deflation is at 1.6% across the board, with figures out yesterday from Kantar. And we've seen...
But milk does remain remarkably cheap compared to other foods.
Absolutely, but then yet, I think, and I'll happily name a shame, in Sainsbury's now there's a Hovis loaf, Hovis good high quality bread, 70, this is another debate for a few weeks time, absolutely, but it's my point is the same, it's 75p for a big loaf, like, that is cheap, and it's the same with food products across the board, but that is helping the consumer because you're paying less. So this debate is more complicated than the farmer just saying we want more. I understand as well, flip that right around, that if shoppers are paying more, there's more value in the chain and they are having to value these products more highly. So I think it's more complicated than just saying that we need to just throw more money at it.
Does anyone else have any? Yes.
Hi, sorry. First, I just wanted to say thank you very much, because I've realised how uninformed I am in this area and that information is really important. But I got the impression you were speaking a bit to converted, preaching to converted, and I wanted to know, because I literally don't know, what are the dangers or issues with raw milk? So all of you generally have said how great raw milk is. If it's so great, why doesn't everyone drink it? Or why is it illegal from vending? I don't understand.
Yeah, okay. Right. In the UK, it is legal to sell raw milk if you're a licensed raw milk seller, and in order to be licensed, you have to be your herd has to be tested TB free, and that would be an annual test. So my cows are tested every year to prove that they've got no TB. Historically, pasteurisation came in for three reasons. Well, it came in temporarily to fight TB, but also it deals with brucellosis in cattle, which if cows have got brucellosis, that milk will cause undulant fever in people, which is quite a nasty fever. But brucellosis in this country was eradicated in the 1980s, so that's no longer an issue. And then you're dealing, the final area of danger, if you like, is bad pathogens such as E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella, Campylobacter, Staphylococcus aureus. If your cows are healthy, if your milking system is clean and hygienic, if your milk storage is clean and hygienic, if your bottling and handling of milk is clean and hygienic, then you shouldn't have those issues in it.
Here's the big question. I mean, part of why Louis Pasteur is considered one of the greatest men who ever lived is that not everyone has such meticulous systems as you might have on your farm.
It's a concern for the Food Standards Agency, who carried out a consultation into raw milk law last year. Their consultation was interesting. One of the amazing stats that it threw up is that 20% of milk consumers would like to try raw milk, which is a huge potential market.
But 80% wouldn't.
Yeah, but you're talking about way less than 1% of the current market being raw milk. So jumping from well under 1% to maybe 20% is potentially huge. And the FSA's concern is and the reason that's not happening is because consumers can't access raw milk. They can't get their hands on it. It's just not really there. The FSA are concerned that if they took the leash off the regulations a bit, then there'll be a lot more producers producing raw milk, and they won't be producing to the same standards that current raw milk producers are. We've been offering to work with the FSA to try and ensure that new standards come in that improve protocols. But there are some staggering things. For example, in the UK, if you sell or produce food, you have to have a HACCP to produce that food, which is a hazard analysis of critical control points within the food production in terms of bacteria and so on. Raw milk is the only food that is exempt, which is staggering. So we're saying to the FSA, why don't you make it obligatory for me as a producer to have a HACCP? We've got our own voluntary one in place, which protects us, and it also gives our consumers confidence that our milk is clean. We test our milk every week for E. coli, listeria and so on, and I can say hand on heart we haven't got those issues. So responsible clean raw milk is great.
I think Leanna has something to say here on the safety of raw milk.
Well, yeah, just historically, there were some food poisoning outbreaks that they believed came from either raw milk or products that were made from raw milk. But they didn't have the testing back then that we have now. They don't have the strict regulations and the ability to look at our milk like we can do now. And yes, raw milk does have the potential to carry certain pathogens, but so do other foods. If they're not looked after properly, they can be far more harmful to health. We seem to have this opinion that sterile food is good. It's really not. Sterile food has zero defense system. If a pathogen arrives and rocks up, where's its army? There isn't any. My herd of goats, I used to milk them in an open field, into a bucket. They may or may not have had a hoof go in it on occasion. And I had no electricity. It sounds like I did it more as an experiment. It wasn't. It was for the love and for the passion of it. And I really did enjoy it. But, I voluntarily sent that milk off because in the UK, I correct myself, in England and Wales, the rules that Steve talked about apply to cow's milk only. Sheep and goat are exempt. I do not know why. They have the ability to carry TB just like a cow can, but we do not test. We are not enforced. We don't have to. And the same goes for brucellosis. So yes, we are brucellosis free, but nobody's been checking on the sheep and the goats. Now I sent my milk off and I got that tested because I wanted to know if I milk outside, if I don't do all these things, if I don't have white-clad walls and bactericide, lurking in every corner, can I still produce something that is good for me? And it turns out the milk we were producing was absolutely jumping with bacteria, but all the right stuff. So I'd much rather put that in my body than white water.
The comparison that Steve made earlier, maybe before the discussion began, was Campylobacter in chickens, the relative risk of that.
And shellfish as well.
Well, that's right. I mean, there's over 1 million cases of food poisoning in the UK every year and a few hundred deaths. In the last 12 years, there's only been 2 possible cases, and they haven't been proven, of food poisoning from raw milk. So raw milk has got an immaculate record.
We're talking about much smaller.
We are, but if I was to give you an example, imagine a test was done, pasteurised milk in one petri dish, raw milk in another, UHT in another. They were left open at room atmosphere for a week. On the UHT sample, nothing grew on it, which is shocking because milk is the growth food and even white paint might grow something on it, but UHT grew nothing, so why put it inside you? On the raw milk sample, that only had good bacteria on it, and on the pasteurised sample, only bad bacteria grew on it. And the theory is that the raw milk sample's got all its good bacteria intact. Any pathogens in the atmosphere that try to go in are repelled by the population of good bacteria, lactobacillus and so on in the milk. Whereas the pasteurised sample, all the good bacteria are killed, leaving a ripe substrate for invasion by whatever's around can go in and colonise. A lady in the Midlands, she phoned me up, she said, I need your milk for my son. His consultant, my son's got cystic fibrosis. His consultant said he needs raw milk. He's got no defence. Raw milk will give him some defence.
I think we might have time for one very last question, maybe one aimed at Charlie and Dill, but anything. Yeah.
As a consumer, there would be concerned with the welfare of animals. Is there any way to tell that milk will have come from animals that have been treated well? I know that it was said, oh, I buy organic because they're outside, and that may mean that they're treated better, but then that was sort of debunked. I mean, is there any way to actually tell?
Should we get Dill to answer this first, and then we'll give Charlie the last word?
The short answer is no. There's no way of assessing the welfare of the animal from the milk itself. To give a bit more background on that, it is far easier, there is a far higher potential for good welfare in an extensive system than an intensive system. I take on board the point that Charlie made before, but I think an awful lot of people make the confusion between good health in an animal and good welfare in an animal. And the simple act of confinement of animal in these very highly intensive systems means it's impossible for them to be a cow. And the model, which involves extremely high yielding cows, pushes them beyond their physiological limit. A professor from Bristol, a professor of animal welfare, once calculated it was equivalent to a high yielding dairy cow is equivalent to running 2 marathons a day in terms of the energy expenditure out of that animal. So that has a very low welfare potential. There is a higher welfare potential in an organic system or in an extensive system, but you can provide bad welfare in any system at all. So I think it's a very useful starting point in terms of animal welfare to be able to say how it was raised. Is it a pasture, is it an extensive or is it an intensive system? It's not a guarantee. I'd just put on the table as well, it's not just about the welfare, it's about the sustainability of the system, and the grass-based systems, I would argue, are far more sustainable and therefore more ethical than something that depends on grain feeding.
So Charlie, how can we trust that the milk we're buying is...
Yeah, I'll finish with more consensus with Dill than we've had at times within it. I think we need to just get away though from the simple fact that outside bad, inside good. Other way around? Crap.
No, you got it right.
Anyway, was that right? Alright, anyway, wrong way around. But my point is, it's not just about whether the cows are spending time outside. There are, as we talked about there is different welfare potential within different systems. Systems of all types can be run incredibly well. There are ways of telling in terms of welfare standards and in terms of the way the milk is produced and the way it's been checked and it's farm assured. The NFU likes to go on a lot about the red tractor that you do see on some products. Not every supermarket uses it. Sainsbury's, for example, doesn't agree that it works and consumers recognise it. But it is difficult. As someone who spends a lot of time speaking to dairy farmers, walking around dairy farms, we have exceptionally high standards of dairying in this country. Our farmers are excellent, some of the best in the world. And I think you can be very, very broadly assured of the good quality. And just think, as a son of a dairy farmer as well, it is not in our interest as a family to treat our animals badly. We want them to be in the best and the finest setup possible. Dairying, sadly by its nature, is farming. There's always going to be some intensive element of it because you're trying to get a product out of the cow, but every farmer will be trying to do the best. So in terms of looking for it, look out for the red tractor if you can. They are above the legal minimums in terms of welfare and standards. Dill raises his eyebrows. And different companies, for example, Arla Foods has their own, or introducing their own welfare standards. They produce certain brands of products as well. So it is difficult, but take an interest where you can, and on a local level, people like Steve, other people that are producing milk and distributing it themselves, there's a greater connection with where the milk's coming from. You can find out a lot more easily. So that's another route as well.
Great, thank you all so much for a really great, fascinating conversation. And I'm sure after all of that, if anyone is part of the 20% who want to taste some raw milk, let me add. So I believe there is
downstairs,
some
yeah.
downstairs.
Yeah.
Sorry, was it, if anyone
I
has...
to add something, sorry, I don't have a question, but I'm Jessica. I used to think for 12 years that I was lactose intolerant. I grew up on raw milk and in South America. I moved to Amsterdam, I had a Dutch husband who gave us loads of milk. We bought it in the store. I was always sick. And then we moved to London and I buy milk at Steve. Someone told me about him. And we travel to the market. We just changed everything. No more Sainsbury's milk, it's all these products, and I can drink it and fine, I can, so that's just an eye-opener, it changed my whole life.
Wow, that's a great recommendation. Thank you.
That's worth 500.